Hi, and welcome to another episode of Horror Insomniac. It's estimated that there are over 200 dead bodies on Mount Everest, many of which have been there for decades. There is even an area on the mountain called Rainbow Valley, which isn't some beautiful valley as the name seems to portray. It's a site that is covered with the dead bodies of unsuccessful climbers. Blue, red, orange, and green colored jackets cover the dead bodies there, which is how the valley got its grim name. From a distance, where the bodies aren't recognizable, this area is ironically colorful, like a rainbow, hence its name. Today, we'll be taking a look at an event called the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, which ultimately claimed the lives of 8 people. The events leading up to the disaster began on May 3rd, 1996, when a group of climbers, led by Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants and Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness, began their ascent of Mount Everest. The group included a mix of experienced climbers and relative newbies, as well as several clients who had paid for the opportunity to climb the mountain. On May 6th, the climbers reached base camp, which sits at 17,000 feet, and began preparing for their summit attempt. On May 8th, they reached Camp 2, which sits at 21,000 feet. One day later, on May 9th, they reached Camp 3, which sits at 24,000 feet. And on the morning of May 10th, they set out for the summit. As the climbers made their way up, they encountered poor weather conditions with high winds and low visibility. Despite these conditions, the climbers pressed on, but soon found themselves struggling to make progress. Many of them began to suffer from altitude sickness and other physical problems, and were forced to turn back before they could reach the summit. Meanwhile, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, who were leading the expedition, were also having difficulty coordinating the climb and ensuring the safety of the climbers. They were unable to communicate effectively with one another and with the climbers, and were unable to provide adequate guidance and support. As the day wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. Many of the climbers were stranded without enough oxygen or supplies, and were unable to make it back to camp. Some of them died of hypothermia and other causes, while others were stranded overnight on the mountain. The next day, on May 11th, rescue teams attempted to reach the stranded climbers, but were unable to do so due to the poor weather conditions. By the end of the day, 8 climbers had lost their lives, including Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Several factors contributed to the climbers' inability to make it back to base camp, including the challenging weather conditions, the physical demands of climbing at a high altitude, and the decision to continue climbing despite the danger. One of the main reasons the climbers were unable to return to base camp was the severe weather conditions that they encountered. In 1996, a series of unusually severe storms hit Mount Everest. The storms brought high winds and heavy snowfall, making it difficult for the climbers to see and navigate their way down the mountain. The high winds also made it difficult for the climbers to set up their tents and stay warm, leading to hypothermia and frostbite. The storms caused widespread disruption on the mountain, forcing climbers to turn back or take shelter in their tents. Some of the climbers who died in the disaster were caught in the storms while attempting to reach the summit, while others were stranded on the mountain after reaching the summit and were unable to make it back down due to the deteriorating conditions. At high altitudes, climbers suffer from altitude sickness and can experience a range of symptoms, including headaches, nausea, and difficulty breathing. These symptoms obviously made it difficult to continue climbing, and altitude sickness can even be life-threatening if not treated properly. As the climbers ascended the mountain, they were at a higher altitude where the air is thinner, making it more difficult to breathe. This put them at the risk of hypoxia, a condition where the body is not getting enough oxygen, which can cause brain damage and even death. The climbers also suffered from heavy fatigue. Climbing Mount Everest in itself is a physically demanding task, and climbers are also required to carry heavy loads filled with equipment up the mountain. The climbers were also climbing at high altitude, where the air is thin and the body's ability to perform physical activities is reduced. The climbers, led by Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, were also unable to communicate effectively among themselves and with the climbers. This made it difficult for them to provide adequate guidance and support, putting the climbers at risk of accidents and injuries. Some of the climbers were also not properly equipped for the climb, with inadequate clothing or equipment, which made it difficult for them to survive in harsh conditions. Finally, the decision to continue climbing despite the apparent dangers was a contributing factor in the climbers' failure to return to base camp. Some of the climbers, including Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, were experienced mountaineers who had successfully guided numerous clients to the summit in the past. Despite the challenging conditions that they faced, they were determined to reach the summit and encouraged their clients to do the same. It is not clear why Hall and Fisher, the leaders of the two teams, decided to continue climbing despite the challenging weather conditions on Mount Everest in 1996. It could be that many of the climbers were paying clients, which made it difficult to balance the need for safety with the desire to reach the summit. This added to the pressure and lack of communication between the guides and the clients. They may have also been overconfident and believed that they had the necessary skills and experience to handle the challenging conditions on the mountain. It's also important to note that the decision to turn back or continue climbing can be a difficult one. Reaching the summit of Everest, and being so close to the summit at that, is a reward that's difficult for climbers to pass up on. Hall and Fisher may have also not realized the severity of the storms and continued to climb with their teams. However, this decision ultimately proved fatal, as the storms intensified and the climbers were unable to make it back down the mountain in time. For the climbers, the situation became increasingly dire as they struggled to survive in this extreme cold and high winds. Hall and Fisher set up tents and tried their best to keep the climbers warm by huddling together and using chemical hand warmers. The two also tried to communicate with base camp and other teams on the mountain to coordinate a rescue effort. Despite their best efforts, Hall and Fisher failed to keep their teams alive, and in the end, a total of 8 climbers died in the disaster, including Hall and Fisher. The bodies of the 8 climbers who died in the 1996 Mount Everest disaster are reported to still be in their original resting spots. It's not uncommon for bodies of climbers who die on Mount Everest to remain on the mountain, as it's often too difficult and dangerous to retrieve them due to the challenging terrain and harsh weather conditions. In many cases, the bodies are left where they are found, as it simply isn't feasible to bring them back down the mountain. In some cases, the bodies of climbers who died have been brought down with the help of specialized teams who use a combination of technical climbing skills and equipment to reach the bodies and bring them back down to base camp. The decision to leave a body on the mountain or attempt to retrieve it is often made on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the specific circumstances and the risks involved. In some cases, the families of the deceased climbers may request that the bodies be retrieved, while in other cases, the families may choose to leave the bodies on the mountain as a final resting place. Wherever they may be, let's hope that the 8 souls that were lost to Mount Everest in the 1996 tragedy are finally at peace. If you've made it this far to the end, I just want to say thank you for watching, and it'd be a big help to the channel if you could subscribe, like, and comment. We'll be back with more scary stories soon.